I love rediscovering memories and disjointed narratives from teenage bedroom channel surfing and childhood, diving into the narratives as an adult, turning those half-remembered characters and impressions into full-on experiences. Sometimes I find stuff that I never could have dreamed of that was cancelled after half a season, failed projects that collapsed under the weight of their ambition, entire worlds and branching narrative paths snuffed out too soon by the crushing hand of market pressure, or brilliant initial ideas that were too unsustainable long-term. These alternate timelines diverge from our own in cinematic form to reflect the world around us. I find myself at the nexus of these winding cuts through space and time, staring down the potential for our worlds and what we might find beyond it, reaching out towards the vast possibilities on the other side of reality. Welcome back to Worlds Between. Thank you for being here once again. If you could, leaving a comment or a like would really help out the channel, and maybe even consider subscribing if you're into sci-fi reviews and discussion, electronic music, general nerd stuff. Lots more coming. I was going to continue on with Stargate reviews, and I even wrote a good chunk of a review for seasons 2 and 3 of SG-1, but I didn't feel like there was much of a point. In season 1, Stargate sets up a really specific formula, and by the time of writing this script, I'm on season 7, and they've not deviated from that formula whatsoever. The show has a habit of introducing new big bads that are more powerful than ever, and then forgetting about them for half a season. Season 7, as a consequence, almost feels the exact same as the first season, just with a few details shuffled around. I care enough to watch the rest, but not to spend a bunch of time digging into the details on a YouTube show. So, we're moving on to Ahsoka. Star Wars. I have really complicated feelings about it. That makes this review a bit personal. I feel like Star Wars means a lot to a lot of people. I grew up in the prequel era. I had the special edition trilogy on VHS that immediately preceded the release of The Phantom Menace. When I couldn't sleep at night as a kid, I'd go into the living room and watch it with the volume almost all the way off. I watched Empire Strikes Back until the tape wore out and shredded in the VCR. I started getting into the expanded universe as soon as I was done watching that trilogy for the first time. I was doing my damnedest as a 6-year-old to read Timothy Zahn's original Thrawn trilogy novels, Shadows of the Empire, whatever I could find at the library or thrift stores. My tiny brain did not retain any of those plot details, just pure emotion, the wonder and overall vibes oozing out of each tome. Issues of Dark Empire were my favorite summer vacation, country town, gas station to find. A perfect escape from the turmoil of life. Luke didn't look like Mark Hamill anymore, but he was still really cool. My sketchbooks were full of air speeders and tauntauns copied out of yellowed concept art books that I found at secondhand stores. Star Wars was everything to me. Time went on. The prequels were far less airtight, full of more egregious plot holes and melodrama, but Lucas's vision carried on, and I was there to see it. The Clone Wars came out, but I'd grown older by then, wandered off onto other things. Star Wars was mostly a memory when I was in high school, a relic of childhood. Soon after I graduated high school, Disney bought it from George Lucas. It's the day a lot of our dreams died. I feel so melodramatic about this. When The Force Awakens came out, I felt utterly betrayed. In the theater, watching it in the second row, right up against the screen, craning my neck just to catch the entire frame of what was going on, everything filling my vision. I laughed until I cried when Kylo Ren stabbed Han Solo and threw him off of a catwalk. I was in my early 20s, and childhood was not just a memory. It was something at that point that lived under my skin and screamed danger into my skull at every waking moment. Star Wars then became a symbol of a youth lost to trauma. If you talked to me about Star Wars during that time period, I would have told you it was dead to me, possibly raised my voice and gotten a little defensive. I was a mess. Star Wars was also a mess. Fast forward to COVID lockdown. I made a cool friend over the internet who I'd seen around in the community. She loves sci-fi just as much as I do. One day she says, hey, if you ignore the Star Wars movies, Star Wars is actually really, really good. Ignore the movies? They were the whole point of Star Wars. What? Okay, so yeah, that was confusing, but I had no idea. And anyway, I was locked in the apartment, so I figured I would catch up on the rest of Star Wars. That's not the sequel trilogy. I don't need to dunk on those any more than everyone else already has. There's enough hate for those to, like, you know, just open up a dark side, like, rift in space-time and swallow the universe if we really let it just fester, you know? I'll leave it alone. At that point, I'd done a bit of healing. Childhood was no longer a horrible, scary mess that I had to distance myself from at all costs. And even still, the present day, in lockdown, was in need of a bit of that old wonder and magic that only good sci-fi can provide. So it turns out, my friend gave me some very special advice. So now I'm caught up. I've seen everything. I've seen Rebels. I've seen all of Clone Wars. I've seen all the stuff Disney's been putting out lately. Got some other feelings about some of that. I have seen the sequel trilogy. Whatever. But there's some magic going on in some of these shows. Here we are at the release of Ahsoka, and I've gone through every stage of grief, passed through acceptance, and I've come to a place where I can accept that, to me, most new Star Wars content is going to feel like extremely high-budget fan fiction. That doesn't mean I can't enjoy it, though. But do I actually enjoy the new Ahsoka series? Would you enjoy the new Ahsoka series? Let's find out. First off, I'm going to assume that you're watching this video after you've seen all the episodes, or you don't care about spoilers. This is your only warning. I'm just going to talk as if you've seen it all. Second, if you're going to jump into Ahsoka without watching all of Rebels, don't. Typically, Disney would write each piece of new content in the Star Wars universe to stand on its own. It's just good for marketing that way. There's a lot to catch up with and a lot of pressure for anyone who's trying to get into one of their fancy new shows on Disney+. So they're gonna tell you, it's fine if you haven't seen everything else. That exact idea was impressed upon potential viewers by a lot of the Disney executives, especially at the Star Wars Celebrations events, when they were talking about Ahsoka before it aired. Star Wars fans could theoretically watch Ahsoka without seeing Clone Wars and Rebels. I heard on Eckhart's Ladder a little while before the show aired that one of the writers let on it might be a little bit more involved in that, and yes, it totally is. If you have not seen Rebels, there's a very, very, very high probability that jumping into Ahsoka will make absolutely no sense. They do set up the biggest concerns in the first couple episodes so that if you haven't seen Rebels, you might be able to get into it a bit or just be like, okay, there's someone named Ezra. Ezra's gone. There's someone named Thrawn. Thrawn is with Ezra. They're both gone. Bunch of people are looking for both of them and they all have their reasons. I guess I can get on board with that, but like, especially with the way that Filoni writes his shows, he's trying to create a connected universe, and there's this weird interplay of nostalgia, just like an expanded universe of like a character walks into a room and they kind of expect you to know who that character is, have really big feelings about that character, and then when they walk into that room and the other characters in the room are also people you're supposed to have big feelings about, you're supposed to be like, oh, whoa, okay, everyone's here, what's gonna happen? So if you don't know who those characters are and you don't know the history of the story from the other shows, it's not gonna have the same weight at all. And besides, Rebels seems like a kid's show. but it's not. It's actually incredible. It's really, really special. You should just watch Rebels. The show is written in such a way that it assumes you already know who all the main characters are, and you already care about them and understand their motivations and their backstories. Without prior knowledge, you'll be introduced to these characters, reading up their lines and wading through tension that has no context whatsoever. One of the things Dave Filoni likes to do in each of the projects that he directs or writes is ground the events of the story and the tone in the same kind of tone, or as close as we can get to what George Lucas originally set up with his original projects. Filoni and Lucas worked together. Filoni is one of the only people who worked extensively with Lucas who is still actively, directing Star Wars media. So it makes a lot of sense that in some ways his work feels like it's pretty true to the core of what Star Wars used to be. That doesn't mean it always translates super well. Sometimes just the format of a show is really weird, just the fact that films and shows tend to play out really differently. Films are typically a lot more grandiose and a lot more social, and shows are a lot more private and drawn out, episodic in their concerns. You get more into the characters, and the story beats don't always feel as big and intense. But anyway, Filoni's definitely bringing that magic back into Ahsoka, and I think his relationship with George Lucas has been greatly beneficial to Star Wars as a whole. A lot of people are saying that, the Filoniverse should just be a thing, and there's, a big deal. Mostly I agree with them. I feel like there can be a lot of good Star Wars without Dave Filoni. Andor is still probably my favorite Star Wars, but it is also barely not Star Wars. Anyway, I rambled a lot there. So it does the writing a slight disservice when, you need to rely on other media in order to feel the full weight of what's going on. But it's not the worst thing in the world. I could have thrown in a couple lines of dialogue to refresh people about Rebels in a slightly more obvious way. They didn't. That's also fine. I am including a link to a really good refresher that Star Wars Explained did. That is just a quick recap of all the important stuff in Rebels. I watched that after watching the first 2 episodes because I was like, oh god, I don't really remember Rebels. What's going on? So I'll leave a link to that in the description. This is basically Rebels Season 5. Ahsoka does feature Ahsoka, the character, quite prominently, but typically you'd think in the Kenobi style of theme or whatever, that if the show is titled after a character, it's going to focus on that character, but with Ahsoka, it's just Rebels Season 5. So in Episode 1, the title crawl looks weird as hell. It scrolls straight up, and it's all red. Whatever. Directors these days are pretty loose with their Star Wars protocol, so I'm trying to practice letting go, living in the present, not thinking about the past. Thrawn is still in the galaxy where Ezra launched them to with the help of the Purgles, who can organically travel through hyperspace. Freaky space whales are very cool. Everyone's got to prevent the heir to the Empire from returning and starting another war with the fragile New Republic. Morgan Elsbeth is a Dathomiri witch who we briefly met in The Mandalorian, and she's freed from captivity by a couple fancy new dark Jedi. They're not actually Sith. They're just kind of evil. The orange lightsaber here indicates a kind of halfway move into that intense pact with the dark side. Here's where the new ideas in the show start cropping up. Clearly, Filoni's not afraid to just have his ideas and run with them and commit to his vision. I do appreciate that quite a bit. These new Dark Jedi, Baylan and Shin really looks like Alice Glass, are both pretty interesting in that regard, even if they don't speak very much, and we don't know very much about them yet. All we know is that they want to free Thrawn, and they are working with Morgan to do so. Ahsoka gets an orb that can show her where Thrawn and Ezra are, which a friend of mine informed me is a little plot device that was stolen from Disney's 2002 animated movie Treasure Planet. I watched the trailer after she told me about that. It's an orb. It's got the lines on it. It creates a star map. It is the same orb. They just put it in Star Wars. That's actually really cute. Yeah, so there's more of the circly things that are in the world between worlds, likely another nod to the ancient architects of whatever that technology is. Maybe we'll get to meet them later. Robots try to take the orb. Ahsoka bails, meets up with Hera Syndulla. The dynamic between Hera and Ahsoka in the first episode feels a little bit flat. It's like the actors were still kind of getting used to their roles, figuring out how to best embody the intent behind all of the writing. Feels a little bit flat, like they're just kind of reciting their lines at each other and like sort of reacting, but not in a really dynamic way. Everyone feels really reserved. All the dialogue is very matter of fact. It's almost as if everyone's like uninterested, which is very different from how Ahsoka showed up in the animated shows that she was introduced in. She is a lot older now. She's probably really jaded and full of trauma. I totally get, that happening to someone and getting older and just being like, oh, this is happening. Oh, this is happening now. Okay. My patience is wearing thin. Oh. I see. I get that. But it's a little bit weird to see Ahsoka be like that all the time. Within episodes 2 and 3, Rosario Dawson in particular, but most of the characters in general, start to ease into their roles a little bit better. Those episodes are also directed by Steph Green, not Dave Filoni, so it's possible that Dave's chops as a live action director might just not be like totally on par with his super high caliber of writing chops. So there's just room for improvement there. There's not too much to say about the first episode. Lothal cats absolutely rule. I want to love and cherish anything that meows like a cat, and I would even consider getting one as a tattoo. Like, probably right here, I have some room for like a Lothal cat. That would be really nice. The plot was a little bit predictable. At least in the first episode, I knew for sure that as soon as Ahsoka left Sabine sitting at the table in her ship with the orb in front of her, she was going to steal it, take it back to her place, try to fix it herself, do it, and then it would get stolen. That is exactly what happened. That's not, the end of the world. It's not like the story itself is like super canned. It's just got some moments where they're making just some obvious choices, and that's fine. We have another example now of a Star Wars character getting stabbed by a lightsaber and living through that. Qui-Gon Jinn's Force Ghost has got to be haunting all these people, following them around being like, how? I'm a Jedi Master and I died, but all these random people who aren't even Jedi, like, they get stabbed in the stomach and they're fine. Kids can get stabbed in the stomach and live. Whatever. It's fine. I guess that's also just a Disney thing. We don't want all the good guys to die early on, because that is too heavy. We're in the realm of the mouse, and we will play by the mouse's rules. Shout out to all the writers and actors on strike against the rules of the mouse and all the profit mongering within Hollywood media. Shout out to E-Wings, which are now finally canon. The second episode feels like the characters are starting to get into more of a groove. The CGI in this show, especially like the shots of the ships in space, very, very, very good. Feels great. The only scene that felt a little too volume-y was where Ahsoka and Hera were on the cart In Corellia, driving through the shipyard, it felt like the Star Wars equivalent of a gently rocking car on a movie set, going by some blurry rear projection of a nameless city.
I used to eat that. Really good noodles.
Building a hyperspace ring with multiple Super Star Destroyer drives bolted onto it sounds like a really wild way to get to where Thrawn and Ezra are in another galaxy. I'm really curious to see how that goes. In some ways, it's kind of like the Rebels once had to fight the Empire using whatever ships they had laying around, scrounging together parts and going at the Imperial forces in short bursts. But now the Imperial remnants are taking up those same tactics. The costumes and sets are all really amazing. There's really detailed realizations of things we saw in Rebels, simpler animated style, coming up in richer color, really good set dressing, just all these like little things in Sabine's room and stuff. Makes everything feel really lived in and alive. A lot of love has clearly gone into the show, and it exists as a group effort to bring a new and interesting story to life. It doesn't feel like a cheap spin-off like Book of Boba Fett, and it's not stale like the later seasons of The Mandalorian, and has a lot more of a cohesive vision than the sequel movies do. A lot of the other recent Star Wars shows feel like they didn't need to exist. They were pretty cool in some aspects, but when they announced the shows, it's like, okay, they're doing this because of money. They're not doing this because they actually have a really good and interesting story to tell. I love that Ahsoka is introducing a new story with high stakes and is clearly inspired by a lot of different pieces of expanded universe lore, even setting up conflicts that feel like a true sequel to the original trilogy, just with new characters instead of Han, Luke, and Leia. The art direction with all the ancient star maps and cool geometry lent the show a bit of a unique flair, which I also appreciate. And we get to see some Jedi doing proper Jedi stuff, or dark Jedi stuff for that matter, which has been sorely lacking from any of the recent shows, except for Kenobi. But even then, it felt really weird and awkward in Kenobi, like he was missing his powers and then he got them back because he started to believe in himself in the span of half an episode. I don't know. The music is done by Kevin Kiner, who worked on the animated shows, which is so good. Although the rock music that Sabine was blasting on her speeder bike felt a bit weird. I get why they used that style of music in there, but it didn't feel Star Wars-y and kind of broke my immersion for a second. Guitars don't really sound like Star Wars to me. Maybe some hard techno would or something. That's fine though. Still cool. And now, it took me long enough to finish this script that episode 3 also released. So I gotta say, now that that's out, I'm really, really loving this show. The story beats in the episode weren't particularly revelatory or intense, but the pacing and the mood. This show's got some really special magic in it that a lot of the other shows don't have. I kind of teared up a little bit watching episode 3. I cry a lot at sci-fi, just because I love space, and I'm a nerd, and I'm like kind of autistic. I'm like, oh my god, it's so cool. So that's how I know it's good. I'm having a full body reaction. Seeing Sabine struggle to use the Force, even without apparent sensitivity, it's like this thing that a lot of kids who saw Star Wars for the first time probably tried to do. I totally remember doing this as a kid, being like, is the Force real? I want it to be real. I want to move that cup. And then, you know, I'm just a stupid kid. Of course, I'm not going to move the cup on the table. But it's so interesting to see a character in Star Wars struggle like that. It's like really relatable in a way that might not have hit the same without like decades of fandom to build up this whole reservoir of experience in us that can then be referenced, but in ways that are really subtle and not like completely meta. Like, oh, they fly now, you know. The dogfights are also really good in episode 3. And it feels like the show is confident in its story and letting it unfold over time. giving each scene room to breathe and develop. A lot of the other Star Wars shows of late have all felt really rushed. Episodes are really short, they're making too many things happen in too short of a time span, but in Ahsoka, we're getting these scenes that just unfold over minutes and minutes, whereas like 3 scenes would have unfolded in like Kenobi or something. I really like what they're doing here. Sometimes some of the scenes might drag a little bit, like in the blindfolded staff training, but most of the other scenes really do benefit from this shift in pacing. Oh my god, and the Purgles in live action, they're freaking huge. They're so, oh my god, the Purgles are so cool. And they're like giant space whales that can go through hyperspace. That is incredible. I love the Purgles. So this episode, like, I'm getting emotional just talking about it. It has this sense of wonder that I hadn't really felt since I watched old Star Wars. And I really, really missed that. If Andor was a show that excelled in telling an intricately woven tale with grim characters and a unique tone for the franchise, feeling like it stretches the limits of what Star Wars can be, Ahsoka is a show that is a return to the roots of what Star Wars has been, the core of why so many of us fell in love with it in the first place. But it carries that essential feeling into a new story with stakes that are practically level with a post-Return of the Jedi sequel arc. And it retains that feeling without just regurgitating the past. It's absolutely bonkers. I love it. Anyway, that's all I have for you for now. I'll check back again once the finale rolls around, and then I can touch on the rest of the show. Thank you so much for watching. May the Force be with you.